By Senator Lyons be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Pursuant to order, I present the report of the Education and Employment References Committee on the immediate future of the childcare sector in Australia, together with the Hansard record of proceedings and documents presented to the committee, and move that the report be printed.
The question is that that motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
And I move to speak to the motion.
To speak to both?
Yes.
You would be speaking to both of those reports?
Yes, Mr Acting Deputy
Senator
President.
Lyons.
Thank you. I would like to thank the committee and also the Secretariat for managing those two references, which we did together, and also for the sector in presenting us with very good evidence, and of the evidence that we received at the 3 or 4 hearings that we had a couple of months ago. We certainly got very solid evidence about quality childcare in this country, and I thank everyone for their participation. And in my remarks today, I'd really like to focus on quality and the importance of quality early childhood education and care. And I'd have to say that that was probably a feature of the submissions we heard from the sector, even from the 1 or 2 operators in the sector who find complying with the new national quality frameworks more onerous. But generally speaking, overwhelmingly, the national quality framework, which is all about quality, was very well received by the sector, and the sector was very concerned to make sure that the reforms that have been put in place and the timeframes going forward were absolutely kept in place. And a number of concerns were raised about slowing those reforms down. But certainly quality was high on the agenda, and the need for young children in early childhood education and care between the ages of newborn babies up to 6 absolutely get quality care. And we know the academic research is there about brain development, particularly for children from birth to the age of 3. That's when the most rapid brain development occurs. And so for children who are being educated and cared for outside of the home, it is absolutely paramount that there is this absolute focus on quality, and that everything we do in education and care services has children and the wellbeing of children and the advancement of their development front and centre. And so it was pleasing to hear, it was a bit of a report card really on the Labor government's achievements in early childhood education and care, and it was a very positive report card. As a former teacher, I'd say it was an A+. That the sector absolutely and overwhelmingly endorsed Labor's national quality reforms. And some of those reforms go to much more acceptable educator to child ratio. We've seen that being standardised across the country. We're still going through those reforms as I speak, but they are on track, and most of the reforms are now done, and we've now got the same standards applying across the country as we would expect. We don't want different standards of educator to child ratio being permitted in one state and a less favourable standard in another. So that's a real positive. The Early Years Quality Framework, which sets out the sorts of learning experiences and challenges that young children should be confronted with or experiencing in the service, was well received, and actually complemented the work that quality centres are already providing. So we got a lot of positive feedback on that. And the child-centred approach, not only were services complementing the former Labor government's approach to this, but we heard from the governing authority, ACEQA, the Australian Children's Education Care Quality Authority, who stressed both in their submissions and their verbal evidence that the NQF was designed to realise these education and development outcomes for children, but not just children, to be supported by parents and families, and also to Australia's long-term prosperity. And we heard that over and over again from academics, from service providers and from associations. And Dr Anne Kennedy, who's the National Secretary of the Australian Community Children's Services, commonly known as ACS throughout the sector, went further by stating that the COAG agreement endorsing the National Quality Framework is the most significant event in the history of education and care services. And Dr Kennedy then told us that we're the first federated nation to achieve these national reforms on such a scale. Certainly a very strong endorsement by ACS. And as someone who, prior to becoming a senator, had a long-term involvement with early childhood education and care in this country, I would echo those sentiments and views as well. That really is what we've done in the early childhood education and care space is historic, and it's absolutely a positive benefit for children and for parents and for our long-term economic viability. I would say of the little, it is a little sad, more than sad. It's I think critical for the current government to continue the reforms that are in the sector, not to be seduced by the minority of voices in the sector who are calling for the national quality reforms to be scaled back. We've seen some attacks on the childcare benefit, but we have a reference coming up on that, so I'll reserve my comments until later. But I have to say that the opposition to Labor's reforms was weak and unrepresentative, and those criticisms mainly came from a submission by the Australian Childcare Alliance, and they didn't quote academic research, but they compiled their views from a feedback from a member survey. That survey in and of itself attracted a very low response rate. Just 8% of their reported membership. I mean, they do say that they're the major alliance for long day care services across the country, but even so, whilst their comments were negative, particularly in relation to children under the age of 2 and the requirement to have teachers in place, their view, their submission only represented 6% of the total number of long day care services in Australia. And to put that into perspective, there are more than 6,000 services, long day care services in Australia. And so for the government really to be seduced or hoodwinked by an association which at best has comment from just 6% of the sector is quite erroneous. The vast bulk of the sector, large providers, in fact the largest provider in Australia, Good Start, commended the reforms, and their submission is a worthy submission. It's well researched, it relies on academic studies, and of course Good Start are in a very strong position because they have services in every single state and territory across the country to be making comments about the implementation of the National Quality Framework. And of course, let's not forget that Good Start picked up the failed ABC centres, many of which were performing extremely badly, and Good Start have had to put a lot of funds into those services to make them the quality services that they are today. So their submission was an absolute endorsement of quality education and care in Australia, and they urged the federal government to keep going with that. And where we did hear of services that are struggling, for example, in Western Australia, we heard from a rural centre in Merredin struggling to attract teachers, but that centre also seemed to be unaware of the funding that the West Australian government has made available through its Royalties for Regions program, where they could actually seek funding. Far be it for me to give a compliment to the Barnett government, but that service, that funding is generous and it is available to regional centres, and certainly we will be talking to that Merredin service about what it needs to do to attract the sorts of funding that will support it. But there's clearly a need for government to support regional centres in more than it currently does. It isn't appropriate to say, well, just because you're a regional service and you can't compete for the services of a teacher in the way that that a government primary school or indeed a private school can, that we somehow lessen that regulation. That's doing a disservice to children, and certainly we don't want to see that. So there's a little bit more work to be done. I urge the government not to fold back those reforms that are underway. That isn't the view of the sector, and I certainly commend the report to the chamber. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.
Thank you, Senator.